The morning the call came, Sarah Mitchell was standing in her small apartment kitchen, staring at a past-due notice that had arrived in yesterday's mail. The envelope sat on the counter like an accusation, and she pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to calculate how she would manage rent this month, while still buying groceries for her 2 children. The phone buzzed once, then again. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her reach for it. A woman's voice, professional but gentle, introduced herself as Margaret Chen from the Veterans Affairs Office in Riverside, Pennsylvania. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Miss Mitchell, I'm calling about your grandfather, Colonel James Mitchell. I'm very sorry to inform you that he passed away 3 days ago. The words hung in the air, sharp and impossible. Sarah's hand tightened around the phone as the room seemed to tilt slightly. She hadn't seen her grandfather in over 15 years, not since her mother's funeral when family tensions had finally torn everyone apart. The last memory she had of him was his weathered face at the cemetery, standing alone by the graveside long after everyone else had left. I understand this must come as a shock, Margaret continued softly. Your grandfather named you as his sole heir. There are some matters that need your immediate attention regarding his property. Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. His property? Yes. The house on Maple Ridge Road and everything in it. The attorney handling his estate needs to meet with you as soon as possible. After the call ended, Sarah stood motionless in her kitchen. The past, due notice forgotten. Images flickered through her mind like old film reels. Her grandfather, in his pressed uniform, teaching her to salute when she was 5. The way he'd called her soldier and made her feel brave. Then the arguments. The bitter words between her mother and his other children. Accusations about money and favoritism that had poisoned everything. Her aunt, Rebecca, and Uncle Thomas had made it clear that Sarah's mother was the problem. That she'd manipulated the old man, taken advantage of his loneliness. When her mother died, they'd shut Sarah out completely, and her grandfather had retreated into silence, becoming a ghost in that big house on the hill. Now he was gone, and somehow, impossibly, he'd left everything to her. The town of Riverside lay nestled in western Pennsylvania coal country, where the hills rolled green and dense with oak and maple, and the houses clung to slopes like barnacles on a ship's hull. Sarah drove there 2 days later, her 10-year-old sedan rattling over the potholed roads, her children strapped in the back seat with tablets and silence. Emma, her 8-year-old, pressed her face against the window. Is this where you grew up, Mom? No, honey. But I visited here when I was little. Your great-grandfather lived here his whole life. The soldier one? Asked Marcus, her 6-year-old son. That's right. He was in the army for 30 years. The house appeared around a bend in the road, set back from the street behind an iron gate that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Sarah's breath caught. It looked smaller than she remembered, more tired. The white paint had grayed with age, the shutters sagged, and the lawn had grown wild, knee-high grass swallowing the stone walkway. But it was the garage that stopped her cold. It sat apart from the main house, connected by a gravel path, a massive structure built from cinder blocks and corrugated steel. The doors were sealed, not just closed but welded shut. Metal plates bolted across them like a fortress. Yellow caution tape, faded and torn, still clung to the corners. A hand-painted sign hung above. Keep out. Authorized personnel only. Emma unbuckled her seatbelt. Why does it say that? Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't, because even from here, even after all these years, she remembered the way her grandfather had reacted when she'd tried to peek through those doors as a child. The sharp command in his voice, the first and only time he'd ever spoken harshly to her. Never go near that garage, Sarah. Never. Do you understand me? She'd been 7 years old and had burst into tears. He'd immediately softened, kneeling down to wipe her face. But the warning had remained absolute. The garage was forbidden territory, and no amount of childish curiosity had been permitted to breach it. Now, standing here with the keys to his estate in her purse, she felt that same childish fear rising in her chest. The attorney, a middle-aged man named Donald Parsons, met them at the front door. He was kind but efficient, walking her through paperwork with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The house would need work, he explained. The plumbing was old, the roof leaked in the back bedroom, but the structure itself was sound. And the garage? Sarah heard herself ask. Parsons glanced up from his documents, his expression carefully neutral. Your grandfather was very specific about that in his will. He left instructions that it was not to be opened until after his death, and only by you. He pulled an envelope from his briefcase, yellowed with age. He left you this letter, said you'd need to read it before you decided what to do. Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. Her name was written across it, in her grandfather's distinctive block letters, precise and military straight. That night, after the children were asleep in the musty guest bedroom and Parsons had departed with promises to return in the morning, Sarah sat in her grandfather's study. The room still smelled of him, Old Spice and leather, and the faint tang of gun oil. His medals hung in a shadow box on the wall. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, ribbons she couldn't name but recognized as markers of sacrifice. She opened the envelope. Dear Sarah, it began. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and the time has finally come for you to know the truth. I've carried this secret for 30 years, locked it away behind those garage doors because I was a coward. I was afraid of what people would think, afraid of judgment, afraid of being seen as weak. The army teaches you to be strong, to never show vulnerability, to complete your mission, no matter the cost. I spent 3 decades following those rules. But when I came home from my last deployment, I brought something back with me that I couldn't reconcile with the man I was supposed to be. I sealed that garage in 1993, right after your grandmother died. I told everyone it was for safety reasons, that there were hazardous materials inside. Let them think what they wanted. The truth was far more complicated. Inside that garage is my real life's work, the thing that kept me sane through all the wars, all the loss, all the nights I couldn't sleep. Your mother understood. She was the only one who ever knew, and she kept my secret until the day she died. I think that's why the others turned on her, blamed her for keeping me distant. But she was protecting me. I'm leaving this to you, because you have her heart. You were always the gentle one, the one who saw past the uniform to the man underneath. I need you to decide what happens now. Open the doors, Sarah. See what I've been hiding, and then choose whether the world should know, or whether my secret should stay buried with me. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you. You were my proudest accomplishment, not any medal or rank. You reminded me that there was still good in this world worth fighting for. Your grandfather, Colonel James Mitchell. Sarah read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking harder with each pass. What could possibly be inside that garage? Hazardous materials, the family had always whispered. Chemical weapons brought home from the war. Illegal firearms. The rumors had swirled for decades, growing darker with each retelling. But the tone of his letter suggested something else entirely. Something he'd considered his real life's work. Something that had required her mother's protection. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, under the glow of a security light her grandfather must have installed, the garage loomed in the darkness. The welded doors gleamed dully, and she could just make out the faded caution tape fluttering in the night breeze. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would open it. But even as she thought it, she knew sleep would not come easily tonight. The morning arrived cold and grey, with mist rolling down from the hills and settling in the valleys like breath. Sarah woke early, her neck stiff from a restless night on her grandfather's old couch. The children were still asleep, and the house creaked around her with the sounds of age and memory. She made coffee in his ancient percolator, the bitter smell filling the kitchen, and stood at the window watching the garage materialize through the lifting fog. If you find this story engaging, Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Daylight. It looked less ominous, but somehow more substantial. A concrete monument to secrets kept. Donald Parsons arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, accompanied by a locksmith and a man he introduced as Jerry Kowalski, a contractor. Thought you might need help getting those doors open, Parsons explained. Your grandfather welded them pretty thoroughly. Jerry circled the garage slowly, examining the metal plates, the bolts, the welds that had sealed it for 3 decades. This was professional work, he said, impressed despite himself. He really didn't want anyone getting in here. Can you open it? Sarah asked. Oh, sure. Couple hours with a torch and a pry bar, we'll have it open. Question is, do you want to? Sarah thought of the letter, of her grandfather's words. Yes, she said quietly. I need to see. The work began with the scream of metal on metal, sparks flying as Jerry's cutting torch bit through the welds. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the noise and the spectacle. Sarah recognized none of them, but they clearly knew who she was, their expressions mixing curiosity with something darker. An older woman with tight grey curls approached, her arms crossed. You're the granddaughter, aren't you? The one he left everything to. Yes, ma'am. The woman's lips pursed. That garage has been closed up since before my husband died. Folks have been wondering what's in there for years. Some said he kept government secrets. Others said it was weapons. She leaned in conspiratorially. My late husband swore he heard machinery running in there sometimes, late at night. What do you think is inside? Sarah met her gaze steadily. I guess we're all about to find out. By noon, a small crowd had assembled in the driveway. Sarah's Aunt Rebecca appeared, driving up in a silver Mercedes, her face tight with anger. Sarah, I heard you were here. Aunt Rebecca, I suppose you're very proud of yourself. Rebecca's voice was sharp, accusing, manipulating an old man into leaving you everything, just like your mother did. The words stung, but Sarah had expected them. I didn't manipulate anyone. I haven't seen Grandpa in 15 years. Exactly. 15 years of silence. And somehow you end up with the house, the property, everything. Meanwhile, Thomas and I, who actually visited him, who tried to take care of him, we get nothing. She gestured at the garage. And now, you're opening that death trap. Do you have any idea what could be in there? No, Sarah said quietly. But I'm about to find out. Rebecca's expression shifted to something almost fearful. Your grandfather wasn't right in the head those last few years. Living alone in this house, obsessing over that garage. Whatever's in there, it's probably junk. Dangerous junk. You should just seal it back up, sell the property, and split the proceeds fairly among the family. The property was left to me, Sarah said, finding her voice growing stronger. And Grandpa specifically asked me to open the garage. He was senile. He was clear-headed enough to write a will. Jerry's voice called out from the garage. Hey, Miss Mitchell, we're through. Doors are ready to open. The crowd fell silent. Even Rebecca stopped mid-sentence, her attention snapping to the garage. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she walked across the gravel, every step feeling impossibly heavy. Jerry and the locksmith stood on either side of the massive doors, hands on the handles. On your word, Jerry said. Sarah looked back at the assembled crowd, at her aunt's suspicious face, at the neighbors craning for a view. She thought of her grandfather's letter, of her mother's secret keeping, of 30 years of mystery sealed behind welded steel. Open it, she said. The doors shrieked in protest, rust and age fighting against movement. Jerry and the locksmith threw their weight into it, and slowly, inch by inch, the massive panels swung outward. Light spilled into the darkness, and a rush of air escaped, carrying with it the scent of dust and oil, and something else, something softer. Paint. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. For a moment, she could only see shapes, large rectangular forms covered with tarps, workbenches lining the walls, shelves stretching back into shadows. Then her vision focused, and she saw the first painting. It hung on the wall just inside the door, unframed but carefully mounted. A landscape rendered in oils, rolling hills beneath a wounded sky, the colors so vivid they seemed to pulse with life. In the corner, a signature, J. Mitchell, 1994. Sarah's breath caught. She moved deeper into the garage, and everywhere she looked, there were paintings, stacked against walls, hanging from hooks, stored carefully in wooden crates. Landscapes, portraits, abstract explosions of color. Some were small, intimate studies, others were massive, 6 feet tall, depicting scenes of war and peace, death and rebirth. She pulled the tarp off the nearest shape and gasped. An easel stood beneath, and on it was an unfinished portrait of her grandmother, captured in the garden behind the house, her face turned toward the sun, with an expression of such pure joy that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "Oh my God," Jerry whispered behind her. He'd followed her in, and now he stood frozen, staring at the walls. There must be hundreds of them. Sarah moved through the space in a daze. Workbenches held pallets crusted with dried paint, jars of brushes organized by size, sketchbooks filled with studies and notes. The walls themselves were gallery spaces, paintings hung with museum-quality care, each one dated and titled in her grandfather's precise hand. Vietnam Memorial Study, 1995. After the battle, 1998. Sarah at 7, 1989. She stopped at that last one, a portrait she'd never known existed. Her grandfather had painted her as a child, captured her with braids and gap-toothed smile, but also with something deeper in the eyes, a dull sadness he must have seen even then. Behind her, she heard the crowd entering, heard the gasps and exclamations of shock. Rebecca's voice cut through, shrill with disbelief. "This can't be real. He couldn't have painted all this. He was a soldier, not an artist." But Sarah barely heard her. She was standing before the largest painting in the garage, a canvas that stretched nearly wall to wall. It depicted a battlefield at dusk, soldiers moving through smoke and fire, but rendered with such heartbreaking beauty that it transcended horror and became something else entirely. A meditation on sacrifice, a prayer in paint. At the bottom, a small brass plaque, "For those who carried me home, Miss Mitchell." Donald Parsons' voice was thick with emotion. "I think you need to see this." He stood by a filing cabinet in the corner, holding a folder. Inside were letters, dozens of them, each from a different art gallery or museum. Sarah took the folder with trembling hands and began to read. They dated back years, some as far as 1995. Gallery owners from New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, all writing to Colonel James Mitchell, all expressing interest in his work. Some offered exhibitions, others offered to represent him. The most recent letter, dated just 6 months before his death, was from a curator at the Whitney Museum. "Colonel Mitchell," it read, "I've now seen photographs of over 60 of your paintings, and I can say without exaggeration that you are one of the most important undiscovered artists of your generation. Your combat paintings in particular represent a perspective we've never seen before, the warrior as witness, the soldier as artist. Please reconsider our offer for a retrospective exhibition. The world needs to see this work." Sarah's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the letter. "He turned them down," she whispered. "All of them." "Why?" Parsons pulled out another document, this one handwritten on notebook paper. "I think this is why." It was a journal entry, dated 1993, the year the garage was sealed. "Margaret died today. The cancer took her fast in the end, faster than the doctors predicted. I sat with her last night and showed her my latest painting. She cried, told me it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever made. Then she asked me again why I kept hiding, why I never let anyone see my work. I couldn't answer her. How could I explain that every time I pick up a brush, I feel like I'm betraying the uniform? The army taught me to be hard, to never show weakness, to never cry. But painting makes me cry. It opens wounds I'm supposed to keep closed. The other soldiers, if they knew what I did in here, they'd think I was soft, broken, unable to cope. So I paint in secret. I pour everything into these canvases, all the rage and grief and beauty I can't express any other way, and I keep them locked away where no one can see, where they can't be used to judge me. Margaret understood. She always did. But now, she's gone, and I'm alone, with all these paintings, all these pieces of my soul. Maybe someday, someone will find them and understand. But for now, I'm sealing this place up. I can't bear to look at them anymore without her here to tell me it's okay to feel. Sarah's vision blurred with tears. She looked around the garage with new eyes, seeing it not as a storage space but as a sanctuary, a place where her grandfather had permitted himself to be vulnerable, to feel, to create beauty from the horrors he'd witnessed. And he'd hidden it all away because he was afraid of being seen as weak. The crowd had fallen silent, everyone staring at the paintings with expressions of awe. Even Rebecca stood speechless, her earlier anger replaced by something softer, confusion maybe, or the beginning of understanding. Jerry spoke first, his voice hushed. "Ma'am, I don't know much about art, but this stuff looks professional, really professional." "It is," said a new voice. Sarah turned to see a woman in her 50s, well-dressed, with an authoritative air. "Excuse me, I'm Linda Brennan. I own a gallery in Pittsburgh." I saw the commotion and stopped to see what was happening. She moved through the garage slowly, examining the paintings with an expert's eye. "My God, these are extraordinary." "You really think so?" Sarah asked. Linda turned to her, her expression serious. "I think your grandfather was a master. This work needs to be seen. If even half of these paintings are at this quality level, we're talking about a major artistic discovery." She pulled out a business card. "Please, call me when you're ready. I can help you catalog everything, get it properly preserved and valued. This is important, Miss Mitchell. This is history." Sarah took the card, her mind reeling. Around her, neighbors whispered, their tones now reverent rather than suspicious. Someone had started taking photographs, capturing the paintings on their phone. She walked to the unfinished portrait of her grandmother and stood before it, letting the tears fall freely now. Her grandfather had painted love onto canvas, had captured the light in his wife's eyes, had preserved a moment of joy in a life that had held too much darkness, and he'd been too afraid to show anyone. That night, after the crowd had dispersed and the children were fed and tucked into bed, Sarah returned to the garage alone. She turned on every light she could find, flooding the space with illumination, and simply walked among the paintings. Each one told a story. Each one revealed a piece of her grandfather she'd never known existed. Here was the soldier, yes, but also the artist, the sensitive soul who'd translated horror into beauty, who'd used color and light to process things too terrible for words. She found a painting of her mother, young and laughing, arms spread wide in a field of wildflowers. The date said 1965, before Sarah was born. On the back, her grandfather had written, "My daughter, still innocent. I pray she never has to. See what I've seen." Sarah understood then why her mother had protected his secret. She'd known that behind the stern military exterior lived an artist too tender for the world he'd been forced to inhabit. And she'd loved him enough to help him hide. But hiding time was over. Sarah sat down on an old stool and pulled out her phone. She dialed the number on Linda Brennan's card. It rang 4 times before the gallery owner answered, her voice slightly breathless. "Linda Brennan. Miss Brennan, this is Sarah Mitchell. We met today at my grandfather's house." "Yes, of course. I've been hoping you'd call." Sarah took a deep breath. I want to show his work. All of it. I want the world to see what he created." There was a pause. Then Linda's voice came back warm with emotion. "I was hoping you'd say that. Can I come by tomorrow? We'll need to photograph everything, create a detailed catalogue. And Sarah, I have to ask, are you prepared for what might come next? If we do this right, your grandfather could become famous. Museums will want these paintings. Collectors will offer extraordinary amounts of money." Sarah looked around the garage at 30 years of secret creation, at the visible evidence of her grandfather's hidden heart. "I don't care about the money," she said quietly. "I just want people to understand who he really was. Then we'll make sure they do," Linda said. "I promise you, we'll honor his legacy." When Sarah hung up, she sat for a long time in the silence, surrounded by her grandfather's art. Outside, the night was deep and still, but inside the garage, under the bright lights, color blazed from every wall. She thought about the letter he'd left her, about his fear and shame, about how he'd lived his whole life, believing that vulnerability was weakness. But looking at these paintings, Sarah saw only strength, the courage it took to create beauty in the face of horror, to remain human in circumstances designed to dehumanize. Her grandfather hadn't been weak. He'd been brave in ways the world had never understood. And now, finally, they would. The weeks that followed moved with a speed and intensity that left Sarah breathless. But before the world discovered her grandfather's secret, there were quiet days when she sat alone in the garage, slowly uncovering each layer of his hidden life. She started with the journals. There were 32 of them, bound in simple black leather, each one dated and numbered. She opened the first one, dated 1963, and began to read. "I'm shipping out to Vietnam next month." The first entry began. "Margaret is terrified, though she tries not to show it. Little Rebecca is only 3 and doesn't understand why Daddy has to go away. I bought a small set of watercolors today. The art supply store owner looked at me strangely when I asked for beginner's materials. 'You taking up a hobby, soldier?' he asked. I told him it was for my daughter. I lied. I don't know why I'm drawn to this. I only know that, and when I hold a brush, something in me settles. Something I can't name." Sarah's throat tightened as she read. She'd never known her grandfather had started painting before Vietnam. She'd assumed it was something he took up after, a way to cope with trauma. But here was evidence that art had been in him from the beginning. A quiet calling he'd hidden even from himself. She turned the pages slowly, reading entry after entry. He described painting in his tent during quiet moments, hiding his work from the other soldiers, afraid they'd mock him. He wrote about the colors of Vietnam, how the jungle green was unlike anything he'd seen in Pennsylvania, how the sunsets could be heartbreakingly beautiful even as violence raged below them. "Watched a village burn today." One entry from 1965 read, "The smoke rose in columns so black they seemed to tear holes in the sky. Jenkins made a joke about it, tried to lighten the mood. Everyone laughed except me. All I could think about was how I might paint it someday. Does that make me crazy? That I see horror and think about composition, about color theory, about how to capture the way light refracts through smoke?" Sarah wiped her eyes and continued reading. The journals tracked his evolution as both soldier and artist, 2 identities he struggled to reconcile. He wrote about the shame he felt, believing that real soldiers didn't think about beauty, didn't cry, didn't need creative outlets to process what they saw. "Thompson broke down today after the ambush," he wrote in 1966. "Started crying, couldn't stop. They sent him to the rear, said he was suffering from combat fatigue. Everyone avoids talking about it, like weakness is contagious. I wanted to tell him I understood, that I spend my nights painting because it's the only way I can sleep. But I stayed silent. I'm a coward in ways that have nothing to do with the enemy." She found sketches, tucked between the pages, quick studies done on whatever paper he could find. portraits of fellow soldiers, landscapes of rice paddies, detailed drawings of weapons and equipment. His skill was evident, even in these rough sketches, a natural talent that had been developing in secret. The later journals, from the 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds, showed how painting had become essential to his survival. He described nightmares that only stopped after he painted them, rage that dissipated when channeled onto canvas, grief that found expression in color and form. Margaret asked me today why I spend so much time in the garage, he wrote in 1982. I wanted to tell her everything, show her what I've created, explain that this is how I stay sane, but I couldn't. She deserves a strong husband, not one who needs to hide in a garage and paint pictures like some kind of artist. So I told her I was organizing my tools. She smiled and kissed my cheek, but I saw the worry in her eyes. She knows I'm keeping something from her. Sarah set down that journal and picked up another, this one from 1,985. The handwriting was shakier, more urgent. I told her. I finally told Margaret about the paintings. She'd been growing more distant, more worried, and I couldn't bear the wall between us anymore. So I brought her out here, unlocked the door, and showed her everything. Every canvas, every sketch, every piece of myself I've been hiding for 20 years. She cried. God! She cried so hard I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. But then she grabbed my hands and said, "Why didn't you show me sooner? These are beautiful. You're so talented, Jim. How could you think this was something to hide?" I tried to explain about the shame, about what soldiers are supposed to be, about my fear of appearing weak. She got angry then, angrier than I've ever seen her. Weak? You think creating beauty from horror is weak? You think having feelings makes you less of a man? Jim Mitchell, you're the strongest person I know, and these paintings prove it. She made me promise to keep creating. Said even, if I never showed anyone else, I had to keep painting for myself, for my sanity, for our marriage. I agreed. But I also made her promise never to tell the children. I couldn't bear for them to know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Sarah discovered that her mother had known for the last 8 years of her grandmother's life. The journals described how Margaret would sit in the garage with him, reading while he painted, offering quiet companionship, how she'd encouraged him to reach out to galleries, to show his work, but never pushed when he resisted. Margaret's sick. An entry from 1,992 read. The handwriting was barely legible, shaking with emotion. Cancer. Stage 4. The doctors say maybe 6 months. I can't breathe. I can't think. All I can do is paint. I'm painting her obsessively, trying to capture every expression, every gesture, trying to preserve her before she's gone. She sits for me when she's strong enough, smiling even though I know she's in pain. Make me beautiful. She jokes. Make me immortal. I tell her she already is. The next journal began after Margaret's death. The entries were sparse, dark, filled with grief so raw that Sarah could barely stand to read them. The house is empty without her. The silence is unbearable. I went to the garage today, stood before the easel with a blank canvas, and couldn't make a single mark. What's the point? Who am I creating for? She was my only audience, my only reason. Without her, this all feels meaningless. I'm sealing the garage, welding the doors shut. Let it all rot in there. Let my secret life die with her. I can't bear to look at these paintings anymore. Every one of them reminds me that I've lost the only person who ever truly knew me. Sarah set down the journal with trembling hands. So that's why he'd sealed it. Not to hide from judgment, but because grief had made creation impossible. He'd locked away his art because it was too painful to face without his wife there to witness it. She stood and walked through the garage again, seeing it with new understanding. This wasn't just a studio. It was a mausoleum, a tomb for the part of himself that had died with Margaret. He'd spent the last 30 years of his life living half alive, his creative soul locked behind welded steel. The discovery made her both infinitely sad and strangely hopeful. Because even in his darkest despair, even believing no one would ever see his work, he hadn't destroyed it. Some part of him had preserved these paintings, protected them, as if knowing that someday they'd matter to someone, as if knowing that someday she would find them. Linda Brennan arrived the next morning with a team of photographers and art historians, and they spent 3 days documenting every painting, every sketch, every scrap of her grandfather's creative output. But before they began the official cataloguing, Sarah asked for one more day alone. She needed to see everything herself first, to understand the full scope of what her grandfather had created. She started in the far corner, where the oldest paintings were stored. These were his Vietnam works, raw and visceral, painted in the years immediately after his return. They showed combat scenes rendered with brutal honesty. No glory or heroism, just exhausted men trying to survive. In one painting, soldiers huddled in a foxhole during a rainstorm, their faces etched with fear and fatigue. In another, a medic worked frantically on a wounded comrade, blood stark against the green jungle background. But mixed among the horror were moments of unexpected beauty. A painting of Vietnamese children playing in a stream, their laughter captured in the tilt of their heads. A landscape of rice paddies at dawn, mist rising like spirits. A portrait of an old woman selling fruit at a market, her eyes holding both suspicion and kindness. Sarah realized her grandfather had painted everything, the full truth of war. Not just the violence, but the humanity that persisted within it. He'd refused to look away from either the darkness or the light. The middle section held paintings from the 1970 seconds and 80 seconds, his family period. Here were portraits of her grandmother at different ages, each one glowing with love. Margaret gardening, Margaret reading, Margaret laughing at some unheard joke. There were paintings of her Aunt Rebecca and Uncle Thomas as children, captured with startling tenderness. And there, tucked in a corner, was a series of paintings of her mother. Sarah approached them slowly, her heart pounding. She'd been young when her mother died, only 17, and her memories were already beginning to fade around the edges. But here, her mother lived again in paint, preserved exactly as her grandfather had seen her. In one painting, her mother sat on the porch steps, pregnant with Sarah, her hand resting on her belly, her face glowing with anticipation. In another, she was older, maybe in her 30s, standing in a kitchen with flour on her hands and laughter in her eyes. A third showed her reading to a young Sarah, both of them curled together in an armchair. Sarah touched the canvas gently, tracing the outline of her mother's face. "He loved you so much," she whispered. "He saw you so clearly." The final section held the largest canvases, the major works her grandfather had created in the late 1980 seconds and early 90 seconds. These were the masterpieces, paintings that synthesized everything he'd learned, combining technical virtuosity with profound emotional depth. One massive canvas, nearly 8 feet tall, depicted a military cemetery at sunset. Rows of white crosses stretched to the horizon, each one painted with meticulous care. In the foreground, a single soldier knelt before a grave, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. The sky above blazed with color, oranges and purples and golds so vivid they seemed to pulse with life. The contrast between the stillness of death and the vitality of the sky created a tension that made Sarah's chest ache. Another large painting showed a group of soldiers returning home, walking off a transport plane onto American soil. But their faces held no joy, only exhaustion and confusion, as if they'd left part of themselves behind and didn't know how to exist in this safe, mundane world. Family members waited in the background, waving and smiling, but there was a distance between the two groups, an unbridgeable gap painted with devastating accuracy. The most powerful painting hung by itself on the back wall, given prominence like an altarpiece. It showed a single soldier, faceless, his features obscured by shadow, sitting at an easel in the middle of a battlefield. All around him raged fire and smoke and chaos, but he painted calmly, methodically, creating beauty while destruction swirled around him. The painting was called The Warrior Artist, and beneath it, her grandfather had written, "This is how I survived. By finding light in the darkness. By refusing to let war kill the part of me that could still see beauty." Sarah stood before it for a long time, tears streaming down her face. This was his self-portrait, his explanation, his justification for everything he'd hidden. He hadn't been escaping the war. By painting, he'd been fighting it in the only way he knew how, by asserting that beauty still existed, that humanity still mattered, that creation could triumph over destruction. When Linda's team arrived, Sarah showed them everything with a mixture of pride and sorrow. The photographers worked systematically, documenting each piece from multiple angles. The art historians examined the paintings with growing excitement, calling out to each other when they discovered particularly impressive techniques or found evidence of influences from masters like Rembrandt or Caravaggio. He was entirely self-taught? Dr. Marcus Thornton asked, incredulous. No formal training at all? None, Sarah confirmed. He learned from books, from studying reproductions in magazines. Everything you see here, he figured out on his own. Thornton shook his head in wonder. That makes this even more remarkable. The level of skill here, the understanding of light and shadow, of composition and color theory. Most artists don't achieve this, even with years of formal education. Your grandfather was a genuine prodigy. The total count was staggering. 347 completed paintings, over 1,000 sketches and studies, 32 journals filled with notes on technique, color theory, and personal reflections on art and war. This is one of the most significant discoveries I've seen in my career. Dr. Marcus Thornton, a professor of military history and art from Cornell University, told Sarah as they stood in the garage, "Your grandfather created a visual record of the soldier's experience that's unprecedented. These combat paintings, they're not propaganda or glorification. They're truth, raw, painful, beautiful truth." But before the reddened cataloging was complete, Sarah made a decision that surprised even Linda. She wanted to reach out to the veterans her grandfather had served with, to show them the paintings before the world saw them, to give them a chance to understand their friend's secret. Linda helped her track down members of her grandfather's old unit. Some had died, others had scattered across the country. But within 2 weeks, they'd located 7 men who'd served alongside Colonel James Mitchell in Vietnam. Sarah invited them to the house, offering to pay for their travel. All 7 accepted immediately, their voices over the phone filled with emotion and curiosity. They arrived on a grey Saturday morning. These old soldiers, who'd once been young men fighting in a jungle on the other side of the world. General Robert Hayes came, his uniform heavy with medals. So did Frank DeLuca, who'd been a private under her grandfather's command. There was Marcus Washington, Jerome Chen, William Billy, Patterson, David, Kowalski, and Robert Sullivan. They ranged in age from 72 to 85, some walking with canes, others still strong and straight despite their years. Sarah greeted each of them at the door, and she saw their eyes drift immediately toward the garage, toward the open doors that revealed glimpses of color within. "We heard Jim had some kind of secret out here," General Hayes said quietly, "but none of us could have imagined." She led them through the garage slowly, watching their faces as they took in the paintings. They moved in silence at first, overwhelmed, stopping before canvas after canvas with expressions of shock and recognition. Frank DeLuca stopped before a painting of soldiers in a firefight. He stared at it for a long moment, then pointed with a shaking finger. "That's Firebase Charlie. April 1968. I was there. We were all there." He turned to Sarah, his eyes wet. How did he remember it so clearly? Every detail. The exact position of the trees, the angle of the trees, light. It's like a photograph, but more real somehow. Because he felt it, Sarah said softly. Not just saw it, felt it. Marcus Washington stood before a painting of a medic treating a wounded soldier. His hand came up to his mouth, and his whole body began to shake. "That's me," he whispered. "I was the medic. And that's Billy." He turned to William Patterson, who'd come to stand beside him. "You took shrapnel in your leg that day. I thought you'd bleed out before I could get you stabilized." Billy stared at the painting, tears running down his weathered face. "Jim painted this? Jim Mitchell, our CO? He painted all of this," Sarah said. "For over 30 years. In secret." The veterans moved through the garage like pilgrims through a sacred space, finding themselves and their brothers in paint, seeing their war rendered with a truth and beauty they'd never imagined possible. Some laughed, remembering moments captured on canvas. Others cried, confronting losses they'd tried to forget. General Hayes stood before the painting titled, "After the Battle," showing exhausted soldiers sitting in the rain, weapons across their laps, faces empty of everything but fatigue. "This is what it really looked like," he said, his voice rough. "Not the heroic stuff they show in movies, just tired men trying to make it through another day." He turned to Sarah, and she saw that this decorated general, this man who'd commanded thousands of soldiers, was openly weeping. "Your grandfather was the best officer I ever served with. Brave, smart, never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. But I never knew he was carrying all this inside him." He gestured at the paintings. "I never knew he was in pain. We all were, I suppose, but we never talked about it. We thought that made us strong." "He thought the same thing," Sarah said gently. "That's why he hid this. We failed him," Jerome Chen said quietly. He stood before a painting of Vietnamese children, recognizing the village where they'd been stationed. "We created a culture where he felt he couldn't share this gift, couldn't admit he needed an outlet. We should have made it safe for him to be human." "You were all doing the best you could," Sarah said. "With what you knew, with what you'd been taught." He didn't blame you. He blamed himself. They spent hours in the garage, these old soldiers, sharing stories, pointing out people and places in the paintings, slowly piecing together the secret life their commander had lived, parallel to his military service. Sarah brought out the journals, and they took turns reading passages aloud, their voices breaking as they discovered how deeply their friend had suffered, how carefully he'd hidden his vulnerability. "He wrote about me," Billy Patterson said, holding one of the journals with trembling hands. "After I got wounded, after Marcus saved my life. Listen to this. Billy will get a Purple Heart for his injuries, and he deserves it. But who gives medals? For the invisible wounds? For the things we see that we can't unsee? For the ways war changes us that no one else can detect? Those wounds go untreated, unlabeled, unacknowledged. I paint them, but I hide the paintings. Maybe that makes me a coward. Or maybe it just makes me human." The room fell silent. Then Frank DeLuca spoke, his voice strong despite his tears. "He wasn't a coward. He was the bravest man I knew. It takes more courage to feel things deeply than to shut down. It takes more strength to create beauty than to just survive." When the veterans finally prepared to leave, they gathered around Sarah on the porch. General Hayes spoke for all of them. "Mom, your grandfather gave us a gift we didn't know we needed. These paintings, they tell the truth about war in a way words never could. They honor what we went through without glorifying it. And they show that it's okay to be affected, to need help processing what we experienced, to use creativity to heal." He paused, struggling with emotion. "There are thousands of veterans out there right now, suffering in silence, thinking they have to be tough, that admitting they're struggling makes them weak. If we can share Jim's story, show them these paintings, maybe we can help them understand that vulnerability isn't weakness. That asking for help, finding outlets for trauma, creating art from pain, These are acts of courage. That's exactly what I want to do, Sarah said. That's why I'm opening this to the world. The veterans each embraced her before leaving. These men who'd shared foxholes with her grandfather, who'd trusted him with their lives. They'd come seeking to understand his secret. They left as witnesses to his truth. After they departed, Sarah sat alone in the garage for a long time, thinking about what they'd said. Her grandfather hadn't just been hiding his art. He'd been hiding his humanity, afraid that feeling things too deeply would somehow diminish him in the eyes of his fellow soldiers. But they hadn't thought less of him. They'd thought more of him. His vulnerability had elevated him in their eyes, made him more real, more relatable, more heroic. The story broke nationally within a week. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran it first, a front-page feature with color photographs of the paintings. Then, CNN picked it up. Then, the New York Times. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about Colonel James Mitchell, the soldier who'd painted in secret for 30 years. The phone calls started. Museums, galleries, collectors, journalists, documentary filmmakers. Sarah's Aunt Rebecca called too. Her tone changed, suddenly interested in preserving grandfather's legacy. Sarah listened politely and declined every request for money or paintings. But one call stood out from all the others. It came on a Tuesday evening, just as Sarah was putting the children to bed. The voice on the other end was young, female, and shaking with emotion. "Miss Mitchell? My name is Jennifer Torres. I'm a Marine Corps veteran. I served in Iraq and Afghanistan. I saw the story about your grandfather on the news, and She broke off, crying too hard to continue. Sarah waited patiently, her heart aching for this stranger's pain. "I'm sorry," Jennifer finally managed. "I've been home for 3 years, and I can't adjust. I have nightmares every night. I can't hold a job. My family thinks I'm broken. And I write poetry, Miss Mitchell. I write it every day, pages and pages, because it's the only thing that keeps me sane. But I've never shown anyone. My buddies from my unit, if they knew, they'd think I was weak. They'd think I couldn't hack it. They wouldn't," Sarah said gently. "They'd understand more than you think. But I'm so scared," Jennifer whispered. "I'm scared of being judged, scared of admitting I'm not okay, scared that if I show my vulnerability, everyone will see me as a failure." Sarah closed her eyes, hearing her grandfather's words in this young veteran's voice, seeing his fear reflected in someone 3 generations younger. "My grandfather felt the same way," she said, "and he hid his art for 30 years because of it. But Jennifer, hiding didn't make him stronger. It made him lonely. It made him miss out on connections with people who would have understood, who would have supported him." "I don't know how to stop hiding," Jennifer said. "You just did. You called me. That's the first step." They talked for over an hour. Sarah learned that Jennifer was 28 years old, living in her parents' basement in Ohio, struggling with PTSD and survivor's guilt after losing members of her unit in an ambush. The poetry she wrote was her only lifeline, but shame kept her from sharing it with anyone. "Would you send me some of your poems?" Sarah asked. "Not to judge them, not to critique them, just to read them, to witness them. Let me be the first person to see your art." Jennifer hesitated, then agreed. 3 days later, an email arrived with a dozen poems attached. Sarah read them with tears streaming down her face. They were raw, painful, beautiful, honest. They spoke of combat and loss, of coming home to a world that didn't understand, of trying to reconcile the person you were before war with the person you became after. Sarah called Jennifer immediately. "These are powerful. Thank you for trusting me with them. You really think they're good? I think they're necessary. I think other veterans need to read them, need to know they're not alone in feeling this way. I could never show them publicly," Jennifer said quickly. "I could never. Not now," Sarah agreed. "But maybe someday, when you're ready, because your words could save someone's life, Jennifer. Just like my grandfather's paintings are doing now." That conversation sparked an idea. Sarah reached out to Linda and Dr. Thornton, and together, they developed a plan. Alongside the museum exhibition, they would create a space for contemporary veteran artists to share their work. A gallery where active duty and retired military members could display their creative expressions without judgment. They called it the Safe Space Project, and they launched it on the museum's website 3 months before the main exhibition opened. Veterans from across the country began submitting work: paintings, drawings, photographs, poems, short stories, musical compositions. Some used their real names, others remained anonymous. But all of them found courage in her grandfather's example, permission to be vulnerable. The submissions flooded in. A Marine who created intricate sculptures from spent ammunition casings, an Army sergeant who wrote children's books about coping with deployment, a Navy pilot who painted abstract expressionist canvases that exploded with color and chaos, an Air Force medic who photographed abandoned military bases, finding haunting beauty in decay. Each piece came with a story, a testimony to how creating art had helped them survive, process, heal. Sarah read every submission, responded to every artist, and slowly began to understand the magnitude of what her grandfather had started. He hadn't just hidden his own art. He'd represented thousands of veterans who felt they had to hide their humanity, their sensitivity, their need for creative expression. By revealing his secret, Sarah had given permission to an entire generation of warriors to stop performing strength and start embracing wholeness. The foundation grew rapidly. The Colonel James Mitchell Foundation for Veteran Artists officially launched 6 months after Sarah opened the garage. Funded by donations and the sale of limited edition prints of her grandfather's paintings, they established art therapy programs at VA hospitals in 15 states. They provided scholarships for veterans attending art school. They created workshops where active duty military members could learn painting, pottery, photography, and writing in safe, judgment-free environments. Linda helped Sarah organize a smaller, more intimate preview of the exhibition for veteran artists, whose work had been submitted to the Safe Space Project. 50 veterans attended, ranging from their 20s to their 80s, representing every branch of service and every conflict, from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Jennifer Torres came. So did a 70-year-old Vietnam vet who'd been writing novels in secret for 40 years, an Iraq War veteran who created massive abstract paintings in his garage, a Gulf War veteran who'd taught herself sculpture. They gathered in the museum 3 days before the official opening. These warriors, who'd hidden their art for years, and they saw themselves reflected in her grandfather's story. Sarah watched them move through the galleries. Witnessing the moment, each one realized they weren't alone, weren't weird, weren't weak for needing creative expression. She saw their faces change, saw shame transform into pride, saw isolation crack open into connection. Jennifer stood before the painting titled "The Warrior Artist," the one showing a soldier painting while chaos raged around him, and she wept openly. "That's exactly how it feels," she said to Sarah. "Like you're trying to create beauty while everything around you is falling apart. Like you're fighting 2 wars, one external and one internal, and the only way to survive is to keep making art even when it seems pointless." "It's never pointless," Sarah said, putting her arm around the young woman's shoulders. "Your poetry matters, Jennifer. Your voice matters. You matter." By the end of that evening, something miraculous had happened. The veterans who'd come as strangers left as a community. They exchanged contact information, promised to stay in touch, talked about collaborating on projects. They'd found their tribe, people who understood both parts of their identity, warrior and artist, strength and vulnerability, courage and creativity. The first exhibition was planned for the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, a major retrospective titled "A Soldier's Canvas: The Hidden Art of Colonel James Mitchell." Linda estimated that hundreds of thousands of people would attend. The art world is calling this a miracle. she told Sarah over coffee one morning. The last time something like this happened was when they discovered Vivian Mayer's photographs. Your grandfather's work is going to change how we think about military art, about PTSD, about the intersection of violence and beauty. Sarah nodded, but she was thinking about something else. Linda, I want to do something with the money. From the paintings we sell, I mean. Of course. What did you have in mind? There are veteran organizations that help soldiers with mental health, with PTSD, with transitioning back to civilian life. I want to set up a foundation in my grandfather's name, something that helps veterans express themselves through art, give them a safe space to be vulnerable, to create, to heal. Linda's eyes filled with tears. Sarah, that's perfect. That's exactly what his legacy should be. They worked together to establish the Colonel James Mitchell Foundation for veteran artists. Sarah donated half of all proceeds from painting sales, keeping only enough to secure her children's future and ensure she'd never see another past due notice. The rest would fund art therapy programs, provide supplies for veteran artists, and offer scholarships for soldiers who wanted to study art after their service. The response was overwhelming. Veterans from across the country reached out, sharing their own stories of secret creativity, of using art to process trauma, of feeling like they had to hide their sensitivity behind their military identity. One letter in particular moved Sarah to tears. It came from a Marine Corps veteran named Daniel Rodriguez. "Dear Miss Mitchell," he wrote, "I saw your grandfather's paintings on the news, and I cried for an hour straight. I've been drawing since I came home from Afghanistan, but I've never shown anyone. My buddies would think I'm weak. But seeing what your grandfather did, knowing he struggled with the same shame, it makes me feel less alone. Thank you for sharing his work. You've given me permission to stop hiding." Sarah framed that letter and hung it in her grandfather's study, which she'd converted into an office for managing the foundation. She thought he would have liked that. Knowing his vulnerability had given someone else courage. More letters arrived daily. A former Army Ranger, who'd been secretly writing novels for 10 years, sent her his manuscript. An Air Force pilot, who painted watercolors during deployments, sent photographs of his work. A Navy corpsman, who'd used poetry to process the trauma of losing patients in combat, sent her a collection titled Words for the Fallen. Each one represented a life touched by her grandfather's story, a veteran finding courage to reveal their art, to embrace their full humanity. Sarah responded to every letter personally, encouraged every artist, and slowly built a network of warrior creators who no longer had to choose between strength and sensitivity. The museum exhibition opened on a crisp October evening, exactly 1 year after her grandfather's death. Sarah stood in the gallery with her children, surrounded by his paintings now professionally framed and lit, displayed with the reverence they deserved. Hundreds of people filled the space, moving quietly from canvas to canvas, some crying, others simply standing in awed silence. Veterans came in dress uniforms, standing before the combat paintings, with expressions of recognition and pain. Civilians came too, seeking to understand something of the military experience they'd never lived. Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mom, all these people came to see great-grandpa's paintings?" "Yes, honey. They came to understand who he really was. Was he famous?" Sarah looked around the gallery, at the evidence of her grandfather's genius finally exposed to the world, at the impact already rippling outward from his secret life. He is now. The keynote speaker was a 4-star general who'd served with her grandfather in Vietnam. General Robert Hayes was 82 years old. His voice still strong, his bearing still military straight. He stood before the crowd with tears streaming down his weathered face. "I knew Jim Mitchell for 40 years, he began. Served alongside him in 3 combat zones. He was the best soldier I ever knew. Brave, disciplined, never complained, never broke. And I never had any idea he was carrying all of this inside him." He gestured at the paintings surrounding them. "I never knew he was in pain. I never knew he needed an outlet for what we all saw, what we all experienced. He hid it perfectly. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? That we created a culture where men like Jim felt they had to hide their humanity, had to pretend they weren't affected by war, had to seal up their feelings behind welded doors. We taught them that vulnerability was weakness, that processing trauma was failure. But looking at these paintings, I see strength. I see courage. I see a man who refused to let war destroy his ability to create beauty, even if he could only do it in secret. And I'm grateful, more grateful than I can express, that his granddaughter had the courage to open those doors and show us what we'd been missing. The crowd applauded, and Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. She wished her grandfather could see this, could know that his fear had been unfounded, that his art wasn't seen as weakness, but as profound strength. After the speeches, Sarah walked through the galleries one more time, reading the placards beside each painting, seeing her grandfather's life story unfold in color and light. The early works showed the world before Vietnam, innocent landscapes and peaceful portraits. Then came the war years, darker, more chaotic, beauty found in impossible places. Finally, the later works showed healing, a gradual return to light, though shadows always remained. The final painting in the exhibition was the unfinished portrait of her grandmother, left on the easel exactly as he'd last touched it. The placard read, "Margaret in the Garden, 1993, oil on canvas, unfinished." The artist stopped work on this painting the day his wife died and never painted again. Sarah stood before it for a long time, studying the brushstrokes, the way he'd captured light falling on her grandmother's hair, the love evident in every detail. He'd been so talented, so gifted, and he'd hidden it all away because he was afraid, but not anymore. A hand touched her shoulder, and she turned to find a young woman in an army uniform, a combat patch visible on her sleeve. The soldier was crying, tears running freely down her face. "Thank you," the young woman whispered. "Thank you for showing us this. I write poetry about deployment, about what I saw, what I felt. I've never told anyone. But after seeing this, I think I'm ready to stop hiding too." Sarah embraced her, this stranger who'd found courage in her grandfather's legacy. "He would have wanted that," she said. "He would have wanted you to feel free to create." As the evening wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Linda found Sarah standing alone in the final gallery. "The museum director wants to talk about making this a permanent collection," she said. "They want to keep most of the paintings here, create a dedicated space, the Colonel James Mitchell wing." Sarah smiled through her tears. "He would have hated that, all that attention." "Maybe," Linda said gently, "but I think he would have loved knowing he made a difference, that his art helped others feel less alone." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "That he would have loved." They stood together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the visible evidence of one man's hidden life, now revealed. Through the gallery windows, Sarah could see the city lights of Pittsburgh sparkling in the darkness, and she thought about all the other veterans out there, struggling in secret, afraid to show their vulnerability. She thought about the foundation they'd created, about the art therapy programs already beginning, about the young soldier who'd approached her tonight with tears in her eyes. Her grandfather's vulnerability hadn't been weakness. It had been a gift, one that was now spreading outward in ripples she couldn't fully measure. The garage in Riverside stood empty now. The paintings moved to climate-controlled storage and museums, but Sarah kept the space exactly as it had been. The easels, the workbenches, the jars of brushes. She'd installed better lighting and added some comfortable seating, and twice a month she hosted informal gatherings there for veteran artists in the area. They came to paint, to draw, to sculpt, to create without judgment. Some produced work they'd share with the world. Others created purely for themselves, for healing. Sarah provided supplies, offered encouragement, and told them her grandfather's story, how he'd hidden his art for 30 years, but how it had saved him nonetheless. "You don't have to hide," she told them. "Not anymore. The world is finally learning that creativity isn't weakness, that feeling things deeply isn't failure, that surviving war doesn't mean you have to stop being human." One evening, as golden autumn light slanted through the garage windows, Sarah sat in her grandfather's old chair and watched a group of veterans working quietly at their easels. The only sounds were brushes on canvas, the soft murmur of encouragement between artists, the occasional laugh or sigh. She thought about the letter her grandfather had left her, about his fear and shame, about how he'd spent 3 decades sealed away with his art. And she thought about how different things were now, how his hidden pain had become public healing, how his secret had set others free. Her phone buzzed with a text from the museum. The exhibition had broken attendance records. Over 300,000 people had seen her grandfather's work in the past 6 months. Print sales were funding art therapy programs at VA hospitals across the country. The documentary about his life was being considered for an Oscar. Sarah set her phone aside and simply watched the veterans paint. Watched them create beauty from pain. Watched them be vulnerable without shame. Her grandfather had been afraid the world would see his art as weakness. Instead, the world had seen it as a revelation, a gift, a profound act of courage. And somewhere, Sarah thought, in whatever place soldiers went when they finally laid down their arms, her grandfather knew. He knew that opening those doors had changed everything. He knew that his secret life had become a legacy of hope. He knew that he'd finally come home. As the sun set over Riverside and the garage filled with warm orange light, Sarah picked up a brush and joined the veterans at their easels. She'd never painted before, but something in her grandfather's story had awakened a need to create, to transform feeling into form, to honor his memory by continuing what he'd started. She made the first mark on the canvas, uncertain and trembling. But as the brush moved, as color began to spread across the white surface, she felt something shift inside her. A door opening, a secret revealed, a weight lifting, and in that moment, surrounded by veterans creating in the space where her grandfather had once hidden his soul, Sarah finally understood what he'd been trying to tell her all along. We are not defined by the armor we wear or the secrets we keep. We are defined by our capacity to create light in the darkness, to make beauty from pain, to remain vulnerable in a world that demands we be hard. Her grandfather had spent 30 years behind welded doors, afraid of judgment, but his art had survived. His truth had emerged, and in the end, his vulnerability had become the very thing that made him immortal. The veterans painted on as night fell, and Sarah with them, all of them creating, all of them healing, all of them finally free to feel without shame. The doors were open now, and they would never be closed again. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.